de médecine dentaire. Et donc on ressent une a priori différente que ce que l'on subit en France. Éventuellement en France, le sens où vous allez sortir avec la kippa, vous allez sortir avec vos tzitzit, vous pouvez faire votre Shabbat, vos Sukkot, votre Kippour tranquillement sans que personne vous dérange, et bien au contraire. Mais vous allez ressentir des actes un peu plus horribles vis-à-vis de la commune de l'État, pardon. Comme on a subi malheureusement il y a 1 an et demi, après l'affaire de Abramovich, donc l'État nous est tombé dessus, a envoyé un président sans rentrer dans les appartements de présidents, des responsables de la communauté, ont mis un rabbin en prison en lui forçant de ne pas manger cachère. Donc il y a plusieurs actes qui ont fait que ma décision a pris de faire une pétition contre tous ces actes qui ont été commis. Il ne faut pas oublier que le Portugal et Porto, parce que nous on est au Portugal et je suis à Porto, qu'il y a eu l'Inquisition au XVe siècle, et donc ils ont toujours cette racine d'antisémite qui va perdurer, je le pense, si les autres pays européens ne réagissent pas, je pense, parce que ça fait 5 ans que je suis ici et que j'ai appris un truc du Portugal, c'est qu'ils ont très peur des avis des autres pays. C'est un pays qui a très peur de l'a priori et du sens que va leur apporter la France, l'Italie, Israël, etc. Contre ma démarche de la pétition, nous avons eu le soutien d'Isaac Herzog, le président d'Israël. Nous avons parlé dans plusieurs journaux du monde entier, pour maintenir ceci. Concernant, je vais répondre maintenant à la deuxième question qui est de le futur pour les jeunes au Portugal et à Porto éventuellement, parce que je représente la communauté juive de Porto et éventuellement les étudiants de Porto. Alors je devrais dire quelque chose qui est... je suis fier et je voulais remercier la communauté de Porto. Je vous dis merci. Merci pour tout. Merci de nous avoir aidés pendant 5 ans. Il faut savoir que la communauté a tout fait pour nous en tant qu'étudiants. Moi, je suis étudiant ici à l'université Fernando Pessoa, l'université de médecine dentaire. Donc la communauté a toujours fait en sorte que nous, étudiants, ayant jamais un examen pendant Shabbat, ayant jamais un examen pendant les fêtes, on a toujours eu le soutien de David, de Déborah. Merci pour tout. Et actuellement, il faut savoir que quand je suis arrivé ici au Portugal, à Porto, il y a 5 ans, c'était le désert. Le désert pour les Juifs qui venaient s'installer. On n'avait pas de minyan pour Kippour. On n'avait pas de minyan pour Rosh Hashanah. On n'avait pas de restaurant cachère. On n'avait pas de supérette cachère. Actuellement, ça fait 5 ans que je suis ici et je suis fier de le dire. Je suis fier de dire qu'on a 3 restaurants cachères, qu'on a un centre communautaire pour les juifs étudiants pour éviter l'assimilation. On a une synagogue qui est remplie à 750 personnes le Kippour. On a un minyan tous les matins, mincha arvit tous les soirs. On a un musée de l'Holocauste qui représente la Shoah. On a un musée de l'Inquisition du Portugal. Éventuellement, ce que je devrais dire pour les futurs jeunes étudiants ou les futurs jeunes du Portugal, c'est qu'actuellement, on a notre place ici. Mais dans le futur, je ne sais pas. Je ne sais pas parce que, comme je vous l'ai expliqué tout à l'heure, il y a une racine d'antisémitisme ici au Portugal et je pense qu'elle va perdurer dans le temps. Et je pense que, éventuellement, une organisation comme celle-ci qui pourrait parler de notre cas dans le monde entier, qui pourrait expliquer qu'ici, éventuellement, à Porto, oui, c'est une petite ville, mais il y a une très belle communauté. Actuellement, on est 600 étudiants. Il y a plus de 2000 juifs, plus de 600 familles juives. Donc oui, je suis content de le dire et je remercie la communauté de Porto, du Portugal. Et merci à tous de m'avoir écouté. Et désolé encore de de ne pas avoir pu parler anglais. Mon anglais est très mauvais. Je vous souhaite une agréable journée et un super séjour ici à Porto et au Portugal.
Unfortunately, we are running out of time, even though we could go on for a lot longer because there's a lot to talk about on the youth. But I would like to thank every single one of you for making the time to be here with me in this great panel. And I think that we have a lot of things to look forward to. I think we have a lot of things to work on in the future. And I think that we're here to stay. As I said before, we're not going anywhere. And this is one of the main messages that I feel like we have to convey to the non-Jewish population, that this is our home because Jewish history is part of European history, and we are the future, and we have a lot to offer. So I want to thank every one of you for your participation, and I hope you will enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Juan, for that great panel. I would encourage every single delegate here, if we're talking about building future-proof Jewish communities, to spend time and talk with each one of these inspiring young people. Ladies and gentlemen, before we move to our next panel, we have a video by the Israeli Minister for Diaspora Affairs and Combating Anti-Semitism, Mr. Amichai Shikli. So if you could have your attention for that. Thank you.
אני מבקש להודות לכם, ובפרט לך, הרב מנחם מרגולין, על פעילות. שלום לכל באי כנס ה-EJA. אני מבקש להודות לכם, ובפרט לך, הרב מנחם מרגולין, על פעילותכם החשובה, בחיזוק הזהות היהודית, בחיזוק הקהילות בכל רחבי אירופה, ובעיקר במשימה הנוספת והחשובה שלקחתם והמסתם על כתפיכם, מאבק בלתי מתפשר באנטישמיות, גם תוך כדי דיפלומטיה ציבורית, ועשייה שהיא עשייה אסטרטגית מבחינת מדינת ישראל, עבודה שהיא ממש לא מובנת מאליה. כפי שאתם יודעים, המשרד שינה את שמו עם כניסתי לתפקיד למשרד התפוצות והמאבק באנטישמיות. אנחנו לצערנו מזהים מגמה של עלייה בנושא של אנטישמיות, ובעיקר אנטישמיות חדשה, שבעצם תוקפת את מדינת ישראל ואת זכותם של היהודים להגדרה עצמית. אנחנו רואים גם בימים אלה מגמות מדאיגות, אם זה כוונה של איחוד הסטודנטים האירופי לאמץ את תנועת ה-BDS, והדבר הזה הוא גם כן מטריד אותנו. אנחנו חוששים שהדבר הזה יפגע בסטודנטים יהודים שלומדים בקמפוסים שונים ברחבי אירופה. כנגד הדברים האלה וכנגד דברים נוספים אנחנו נצטרך לעבוד ביחד, בשום שכל, בתוך נחישות ודבקות במטרה. צריך לשים לב שהמערכה נגד תנועת החרם ונגד האנטישמיות החדשה, צריך להתייחס אליה כמלחמה לכל דבר ועניין. אין פה מקום לא לייאוש ולא להרמת ידיים. אנחנו צריכים להיות פה בגישה שהיא גישה הרבה יותר התקפית והרבה פחות סלחנית כלפי התופעה החדשה הזאת, שכן בסופו של דבר מה שאנחנו רואים בקצה זה ששוללים מאיתנו את זכותנו להגדרה עצמית, זה אומר ששוללים מאיתנו את היכולת להגן על חיי אזרחים ביו"ש, כפי ששמענו את נציגת האו"ם עצמה, פרנצ'סקה אלבניז, שבאה ואמרה שאין למדינת ישראל את הזכות להגן על אזרחיה. היא אמרה את זה בהקשר של רצח לוסי די ושתי בנותיה מאיה ורינה, השם יקום דמם, ולכך הדברים מגיעים. זאת המשמעות של דה-לגיטימציה, זאת המשמעות של האנטישמיות החדשה, וכנגד הדברים האלה אסור לנו לוותר. ויחד אני מאמין שאנחנו נוכל להם, כי האמת איתנו, צדקת הדרך היא איתנו, ובסופו של דבר זהו גם מאבק בין טוב לרע.
Lovely to hear some good Israeli dugriness from the minister there. And it's very interesting that he did, in fact, add combating anti-Semitism to his portfolio, which is a strong statement of commitment to our cause. Ladies and gentlemen, it now gives me great pleasure to introduce a man who really needs very, very little by way of introduction. Rabbi Andrew Baker, who is the personal representative of the chairman in office on combating anti-Semitism at the OSCE, who's going to make some keynote remarks. So please give a warm EGA welcome to Rabbi Andrew Baker. Rabbi, thanks for coming.
Well, it's good to be here with all of you. The story I want to tell you actually begins about 21 years ago. In fact, 21 years ago, this month, Javier Solana made one of his regular visits to Washington. He was, as many of you know, responsible for EU foreign policy. He typically would come to Washington, meet with the Secretary of State. On this occasion, he wanted to talk, as he often did, about restarting the Middle East peace process. But he was advised, you know, in addition to talking to the Secretary, you should go up to Capitol Hill, meet with members of Congress. And he did. And much to his surprise, they didn't just ask him about the Middle East, they asked him about the resurgence of anti-Semitism in Europe. And it caught him by surprise. I was with him that evening, and he said to me, "I don't see it. I don't see it." He wasn't denying it, but he was stating a basic fact. In fact, there were incidents of anti-Semitism, but most governments didn't even have a process by which they would identify hate crimes of any variety, let alone anti-Semitic hate crimes. So nobody was recording, nobody was reporting, and it was almost as though they did not happen. Now, where you did have a surge in anti-Semitic incidents, often coming from parts of the Arab and Muslim communities in these countries, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, and in France, government leaders were quick to deny that this was even anti-Semitism. It was either vandalism perpetrated by unemployed youth. Somehow the Jewish targets were only incidental. Or conversely, yes, those targets were intended, but you know, this was because of politics in the Middle East, the breakdown of the peace process, the Second Intifada. And so if you were angry about what was going on, it was as though targeting a school bus with Jewish kids was not an anti-Semitic act, it was simply some kind of political statement. And so what began was a real process, first to get governments to acknowledge there was a problem, and then getting them to do something about it. We had the legacy already a year before of the Durban Conference Against Racism, where the Zionism is Racism canard was revived. There were efforts then looking first at the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. It brought together Europe and the United States as perhaps a venue to organize a conference on anti-Semitism. And that took place in 2003, the first international organization to hold a conference focused exclusively on that problem of anti-Semitism. I was there, I was part of it, and I can assure you many governments that attended imagined we would do one conference, one time, and move on to something else. But that was not what happened. At the end of that conference, the delegation from Germany stood up and said, "We want to host a follow-up conference next year in Berlin." And so in 2004, the OSCE had a truly high-level conference focused on anti-Semitism, opened, in fact, by the German president, chaired by its foreign minister. And in the course of that conference, there was issued what came to be known as the Berlin Declaration on Combating Anti-Semitism. It was notable for a couple of reasons. It asserted that anti-Semitism had taken on new forms and manifestations, at least an implicit reference to what we all understood. There was a kind of anti-Semitism now related to the state of Israel. Israel itself was demonized, its very right to exist called into question. And Jews in Europe were being targeted, as it were, surrogates for the state of Israel. It also went on to say that events in the Middle East and in Israel can never justify anti-Semitism. Keep in mind that almost at the same time you had political leaders, if not saying they justified anti-Semitism, at least rationalizing what was taking place. And it went on to identify certain commitments that governments would take on themselves, notably to work on identifying and responding to hate crimes. And that set in process something now that has gone on for years, even for decades. Again, identifying the problem and getting governments to step forward and address it. Parallel to this, the European Monitoring Center on Racism and Xenophobia, an EU center responsible for looking at these issues, commissioned its first study of anti-Semitism in the EU. It issued its report almost at the same time as this conference in Berlin, and the report itself effectively had two parts. One part tried to cull from existing data, opinion surveys, accounts of incidents, to try to give an overall report of the problem of anti-Semitism. And that report was rather mixed. Not surprising, as I referenced, many countries weren't recording hate crimes, so they didn't have much of a record of recording anti-Semitic incidents. But the director and her staff of that EUMC also interviewed Jewish leaders in the EU. And the picture they described was a much more troubling one. You had survivors of the Holocaust in Western Europe saying, "I'm not sure we should have come back and resettled where we have." There truly was a sense that there was reason to be alarmed. We knew there were increases in incidents of anti-Semitism, but again, you had the combination not only of more incidents, but of governments that were blinded, willfully blinded to what was taking place. In some countries, you've heard representatives from France, the French policy of laïcité meant you couldn't even record incidents or perpetrators based on religious affiliation. So it was as though they were blind to the source of the problem. In other countries, Sweden, an example, they understood where the problem originated, but for political reasons, they also didn't want to confront it. So again, you had attacks taking place and Jewish communities themselves feeling their governments were not willing to recognize it. Notably, that EUMC report acknowledged one of its own shortcomings. It had monitors in each of these EU states, but half of them had no definition of anti-Semitism. And of those that did, no two definitions were the same. That opened a door. I spent first time discussing with the EUMC director the importance of coming up with a comprehensive definition of anti-Semitism that could be used throughout Europe, but certainly by the EUMC. And she agreed that we should try and do that, and then we set in place work that went on for about 5 or 6 months with Jewish experts dealing with anti-Semitism in Europe, in America, and in Israel, to put together a comprehensive definition, a definition with clear examples that could be used by people who would need to know. And that, in short, became what has been called the working definition of anti-Semitism. In the case of the EUMC, the director was very clear. She said, if I have to go to my political board and receive endorsement from all of these EU country representatives, we won't get anywhere. But I can issue it as a quote-unquote working definition. Effectively, put it out there, use it, see how it works. And that was its origin. And notably, as you know, it includes clear examples on anti-Semitism related to Israel. If the state of Israel is demonized, if its very existence is challenged and called into question, if it is held to standards that no other country is expected to meet, this is not just criticism, it's a form of anti-Semitism. And notably, that definition indicated that criticism per se is not anti-Semitism. And of course, even these examples may be examples of anti-Semitism depending on the context. I can say to a degree, the rest is history. That definition found its way throughout Europe and into America and elsewhere around the world. Again, it was meant to be a practical tool, a tool for guidance to understand the problem. I wish I could say it was only a matter of governments stepping forward and acknowledging what they were failing to view, but the reality is we saw such a dramatic increase continuing of anti-Semitism in Europe, of attacks, of lethal attacks on Jewish targets, that no one could possibly look away. We've had successive conferences. We've had a growing effort to get governments to step forward, certainly in the area of Jewish community security, that was frankly hard to believe back in 2002 when Javier Solana said, "The problem, I don't see it," would have led us to believe. Where are we now so many years since? Eventually, that EUMC closed its doors. It was taken over by another larger agency in the European Union, FRA, the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights. And ironically, that definition became a kind of orphan definition. FRA took the position that it is not there to define anti-Semitism or to define any form of prejudice. That's up to the group in question to do so. And so somehow the definition, even as it was gaining more adherence, had a name that was almost, well, it was a kind of anachronism. The EUMC working definition of anti-Semitism when the EUMC no longer existed. And so it was that in 2016, when Romania assumed the chair of IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, its chair decided, you know, why don't we as IRA take on this definition, a definition gaining greater use, but still a definition now without a formal home, if you will. And so in May of 2016, it was adopted as the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, and it has been known as that since then. At the same time, within the OSCE, there was an effort for that organization to formally adopt this definition. I will point out that at the time, the OSCE was chaired by Germany, that was to say by its foreign minister, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, and now President Steinmeier, but at the time he decided he wanted to get the OSCE to endorse this definition. Those of you who know that organization know that it can only make decisions by consensus. All of its 57 participating states have to agree. We came very close in the end of 2016 to a formal OSCE adoption, but one country stood in the way, and that was the Russian Federation. And it's hard really for me to explain why it was. In fact, I had occasion to talk with its representatives in the OSCE. They said, well, we have two problems with this. One is it's the IRA definition, and we're not a member of IRA. Of course, most of the OSCE countries were also not members of IRA. And they said, you know, our experts have some trouble with this definition. Well, I think that was not entirely the case. But I said, okay, are those the only two problems? To which they said to me, well, for now. Well, only two problems for now. So at the end of the day, we had the tacit implicit, explicit support of every country except for the Russian Federation. But that notwithstanding, we've seen it now being used in the OSCE and ODIHR police training efforts, educational efforts on anti-Semitism, and we've seen it evolve so that it's fully embraced, again, throughout Europe and in much of America. The European Union in 2015 had a position of a coordinator on the fight against anti-Semitism. Katharina von Schnurbein was the first and current person to hold that position. And we've seen how within the EU, this definition has advanced so it is the recommendation for all EU member states to use to apply. And so I think with some irony, that organization, FRA, which effectively banished the definition from its website back in 2013, now is tasked with polling every EU member state to determine how they are employing this working definition of anti-Semitism. I don't want to say the definition is the panacea to our problem. Surely it is not. But I think as all of us recognize, if you can't properly identify a problem, you surely will not find the way to deal with that problem. That's why this definition is so important. As we've had more governments develop their own national strategies to combat anti-Semitism, we've seen them use this definition as part of those strategies. In fact, as I mentioned, some of the first efforts to press Europeans on dealing with anti-Semitism came from the United States. Well, no secret now, we have the same problems in America that you have in Europe. Only perhaps we've recognized them only more recently. And so we have a US administration that only in December decided we need and will develop an American national strategy on combating anti-Semitism. Inherent in this is to say we are not going to address the problem as though everything is the same, as though it's all just a common effort to fight racism, intolerance, and xenophobia. We know anti-Semitism is a unique phenomenon in many ways. The solution may not be a solution unique. You need to collect hate crime data, you need to disaggregate it, you need to know where those anti-Semitic incidents occur, and if possible, by whom. But efforts to collect data involve the society across the board. If you're going to deal with security, you need to deal with security for all vulnerable groups in the country. But nevertheless, if you don't understand the unique aspects of anti-Semitism, you truly will not be able to address it and deal with it. And now we've recognized that in Washington, as you have in many European countries as well. Now it happens, and with this I will end, next month the United Nations is convening a meeting in Córdoba, Spain, hosted by its Deputy Secretary General and focal point for anti-Semitism, Miguel Moratinos, where he intends to present a United Nations action plan on combating anti-Semitism. A number of us have met with him over the years. I can point out that the year after that Berlin OSCE conference took place in 2004, Moratinos, as the foreign minister of Spain, decided he would hold a follow-up conference in Córdoba, Spain. So it is somewhat interesting that we would return to Córdoba next month to hear about what the UN will do. We believe it's critical that the UN accept the IRA working definition as an inherent part of its action plan to deal with anti-Semitism within the UN system, but of course, to deal with the problem globally. There is, in fact, right now an effort to join together Jewish communities and organizations from around the world on a single letter to the UN Secretary General explaining the importance of using this definition and why it must be part of a UN strategy as well. So I would encourage all of you in your own capacities, leading communities and organizations, to join together in signing this appeal to the United Nations. The European Jewish Association has the information on how to find this link, this contact, and allow you to sign up for it even today. Again, it's still a battle, it's still a fight to get anti-Semitism understood and defined in its unique phenomena, and to get governments to recognize that and work to deal with it in that way. But again, as much as you see and sense the challenges that still remain, looking back as we can now, virtually over 2 decades, we can certainly say that real progress has been made. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi. By the wonders of modern technology now, we're going to be crossing to London. And hopefully, if it's all connected properly, we should have via Zoom Lord John Mann, who is the UK's coordinator against anti-Semitism.
And you do have him.
Wonderful. We're just currently looking for your... Sir. First of all, hello, welcome to Porto. And thank you so much for your patience. We've had an awful lot to talk about this morning. And as you probably know, we Jews like to talk a lot. So thank you very, very much for your patience. Lord John Mann, we have with us as well a sizable delegation from the National Jewish Assembly. And we are, of course, the European Jewish Association. Have you found, or what are some of the challenges that you faced post-Brexit, if any, in combating anti-Semitism? And just wondering generally, my Lord, if you can give us an update as to what your office is working on right now in the United Kingdom.
Of course. Well, I'm delighted to be with you virtually, and sorry that I can't be...
Israel, and because it was 1 year to Shireen Abu Akleh that she got killed in Israel. So please. So I think right now the main challenge is the delegitimation of Israel and the double standard against Israel. And this is the new anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism, it's a unique phenomenon. The hate speech against Israel and the double standard against Israel. It's not a new It's not a new concept, it's a renewed one. Every year, every time there is something against Israel, and the Jews are always the one to blame. The Jews are the one to blame because of the war in Russia and Ukraine. The Jews are the one to blame in the coronavirus, the COVID-19 pandemic. The Jews are always the one to blame. And we need to stand still and fight against those phenomena. And be strong. And I think right now I'm talking not only about anti-Semitism, about the community resilience, about the identity, the Jewish identity that it's so important for us to keep and to be focused on.
Okay, thank you for that, Racheli. Hope you don't mind me just using the first name. I'm going to move to the esteemed gentleman to my right, Mr. Stefan Hensel, who's the Commissioner for Jewish Life in Hamburg. Now, most of the commissioners for combating anti-Semitism, or indeed the special envoys in member states, don't come from the Jewish community. Mr. Hensel is an outlier in that regard, in that he's Jewish, and he was specifically appointed by Hanseatic Hamburg because of his Jewish background. So, Mr. Hensel, my question is, first of all, does that Jewish background inform your decision-making in a unique way? Do you find you're taken more seriously, and are you less likely to tolerate or accept other forms of discrimination or racism being discussed in the same breath as anti-Semitism? I know that's a rather large question, but if you can manage, I'll be grateful.
I probably need your help to remind me of a few of these questions and a few aspects. So I do believe that being a Jew myself does not really help for a very simple reason, because before I can actually get to the topic, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with the situation of the Jewish community in Germany, most Germans would say they have never met a Jew, even so that might not be true because we are not visible. Many people came from the former Soviet Union, so the Jewish identity is very low. So before I can actually start talking about legislation, strategy papers, IRA definition, national strategies, people talk to me about Jewish things. And we all know that anti-Semitism is not a problem for, they make it our problem, but it's not a Jewish problem. It's a problem for society. Society has a problem. We all know a society that is anti-Semitic cannot strive. A society that is not democratic will not produce the best outcome. I find it rather complicated to be a visible Jew, and it's also not good for my emotional well-being, I must say.
Okay. So I'll sort of expand a bit on the second bit. Obviously, being Jewish, it's very hard not to take it personally. Of course it is. It's completely natural. In terms of this notion of bringing in other forms of discrimination and tackling anti-Semitism as a sort of broader form of discrimination tied in with LGBTQ rights, or the Roma, as we heard earlier on from our dear friend from Romania. What's the model in Germany? Does Germany separate and keep anti-Semitism separate, or are we seeing a trend emerging of bringing these tackling anti-Semitism as a whole package with other forms of discrimination?
I think it's a worldwide trend to put all of these forms of discrimination together. The German case is a bit specific and particular because of the Shoah, so there's a bigger emphasis on Jewish life and on anti-Semitism, as I understand. And at the same time, I think we do need to understand, and I'm not against combating all these other forms of discrimination, and I think it's much needed. But it's also a way of pushing Jews into a position where it's assimilation, because an Orthodox Jew does not need to believe in gay marriage. They do not need to marry gay people. They will not act against it, but these kind of attempts are a way to push the Jewish community into assimilation. It's very simple. If you don't want to perform a gay marriage, just don't be gay. It's fine. But leave people alone. Leave the Jewish communities alone and let them decide how to carry on with their daily business. And I think it's very particular, and I was very happy to hear many people pointing this out. And again, I support LGBT plus rights, the Roma rights, minority rights. Don't get me wrong, but I do think we have the right to determine ourselves, and we have the right to determine how Jewish life is going to be in 15, 20, and 25, and longer, time to come years. And it's not on society to decide what we have to do or what we not have to do. It's on us.
Thank you. I would agree with that, and if I can add to it before I come to the... actually, it looks like you want to jump in there. But I was just about to say, before we come to Yaakov, that sometimes it feels as Jews that it's society that is trying to tell us what anti-Semitism is in a way that if you're black or other, you get to define yourself what offends you, but other people will try and tell us what offends us. Racheli, sorry, you wanted to jump in.
No, it's okay. Anti-Semitism is a radical form of the racism. And I think it cannot be compared to any other discrimination. This is what is so unique in anti-Semitism, and I want to clap my hand for you.
Yeah, it was great stuff. Thank you. Yaakov, vous avez été très très patient. Je vous remercie. Yaakov, vous venez de Waterloo, en Belgique, un lieu assez fameux pour un énorme champ de bataille. Vous êtes bien sûr président d'une communauté en Belgique. Puis-je vous demander quels sont vos principaux champs de bataille pour votre communauté et vos défis?
Merci. D'abord, je me présente, je m'appelle Jackie Benzenou, je suis président de la communauté israélite de Waterloo, que j'ai créée il y a 33 ans avec ma femme qui est là-bas. Je remercie tout d'abord Monsieur le rabbin Menachem Margolin de m'avoir invité à ce panel extraordinaire. Je suis très fier d'être là et très ému. Pour revenir à la question, la communauté de Waterloo, c'est une petite communauté qui se trouve en Belgique et on a les mêmes problèmes que tout le monde. C'est-à-dire qu'il n'y a pas assez de gens qui veulent venir à la synagogue et on remarque quelque chose de très grave, c'est qu'il y a une assimilation très très grave. Tout le monde parle de l'antisémitisme, c'est formidable, je suis d'accord, il faut combattre l'antisémitisme, mais il y a quelque chose qui me tient à cœur en tant que fondateur d'une synagogue, c'est l'assimilation. De plus en plus de gens ne viennent plus ni dans les événements communautaires et par conséquent aussi pas à la synagogue. Et ça, c'est ce qui m'inquiète. Le plus de travail que je fais dans cette communauté, c'est d'amener les gens et de revenir un peu à la tradition si ce n'est pas à la religion. Ça, c'est le plus grand défi que nous, on a aujourd'hui.
Okay, so I'm just going to, for the rest of our guests, just briefly, what Yaakov was saying was that the biggest challenge that the community faces in his small community is not necessarily anti-Semitism, it's not necessarily anti-Zionism, it's assimilation and not enough people coming to shul, which I believe is a point that, one of the points that Rav Margolin was talking about earlier on as well. So thank you for that. Racheli, I'm going to come back to you, if I may, before we sort of wind this panel down, because I think some people might need some caffeine fairly shortly. You're based in Israel. So sometimes it's very, very difficult for us European diaspora Jews to see what's going on in front of our noses. What is your impression of how Europe looks right now? I mean, you spoke about anti-Zionism being the latest manifestation. Looking on from Israel, are you more concerned than a couple of years ago, the same, or less concerned?
Okay, I'm very concerned. I'm very concerned because we, as the World Zionist Organization, are being reported for around, in the average of 10 incidents, anti-Semitic incidents per day. The problem, I know around only